fantasy short stories. Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron. Chapter 29, Dust in Time. 2 yeses, 2 nos, and with 1 chance left, Eric's brain would not shut up. His thoughts were a frantic spiral of unanswered questions. Would this god have it out for him like the other 2? Should he play it fair this time or forgo the trial entirely? Could he run and hide forever from the divine if he did? Assuming he could even escape the past with his shade still in tatters. He clenched his fingers tight around the metal railing of the gondola and closed his eyes. In desperation, Eric had already attempted to jump back into the past twice already, almost achieving it in the Mugrarnen's elevator when a magma spider dropped onto his shoulders. But it was no use. Without the touch of the divine, or the machine they left back in Kunskap, he had no way to bridge the gap in his soul on his own. Perhaps he could trick this god into sending him back and then making a second jump from there while his shade was still patched, and find a space in his own timeline to hide. Well, no, that wasn't a solution. What would he do when the god's temporary fix faded? He wouldn't be able to run forever. Eric scrubbed at his scalp with his free hand. They would surely have a tether on him, a way to locate him, just like Kadiane had when she found him the first time. Could he somehow sever it? Or perhaps... Hey! Eric jolted as he was gently nudged with an elbow. He belatedly realized the Selkie had been talking to him, and his mouth clamped into a line.
Sorry, what were you saying?
Giving him a worried once-over, Indiga shrugged. It's not important. Are you all right?
Of course.
Eric forced on his trademarked award-winning smile and moved his hand from his hair to gesture at his surroundings.
I'm just, not a big fan of heights, that's all.
He didn't used to be afraid, but after falling from a sky vortex, that nearly killed him by the way, and being dangled from a window over 100 feet high, he found it made him more than a little squeamish. Smirking, Indiga leaned over to look through the open gap of the gondola. The Strixari, the race of owl folk that lived at the top of the volcano, had sent for them the moment they returned to the surface, and provided them with the means to make the journey up the mountain. Oh, it's not so bad. At least we're making the trek at night, where you can't see how high up we are.
I can tell by the lights from the city below.
Indiga nodded, knowing full well it wasn't heights bothering his friend, then reached out to pat him on the shoulder. It's okay to worry about him.
What?
Eric's mush of a brain, taxed with the innumerable spiraling thoughts, struggled to parse just who the Selkie was talking about when it hit him.
Oh, him. No,
I might not have liked him much, but he's your friend. Indiga smiled. It's natural to be concerned, but don't let it distract you from the here and now. Struck of words, Eric could only turn his attention toward the darkness outside of the gondola. Staring down at the rapidly shrinking lights, a memory dusted itself off in his mind. When they were younger, his dad had flown him and his brother to the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains, chasing down another lead. He remembered looking over the Great Plains as the horizon swallowed the sun, painting the patchwork of farmland in violent hues. Vil had gripped his hand so tight every time the plane made a bump or dip. He could still sometimes feel the ache in his tendons. He smirked at the memory. Maybe that moment in the past would be one he could take refuge in, using it to hide from the god, and perhaps prevent his father from leaving. His mind started idly working out how to sabotage their flight plan when the Selkie broke his concentration once more. Besides, Artemis wouldn't want you to be sad. I'm sure he's having the time of his life down there. Indiga leaned back, playing with Duck's curly tail. Well, as long as he steers clear of those magma spiders. The Mugrarnens had agreed to teach the necromancer their craft, and if circumstances had allowed, Eric would have jumped at the chance to do the same. Instead, he was here, on his way to dance and sing for yet another self-important deity.
I'm not sad. I'm angry. And I don't know why you care anyway. The two of you fought like cats and dogs.
He gave Duck a quick glance.
Sometimes literally.
You've changed. Indiga clicked his tongue against his teeth. Ever since your time with Arkesh, what happened in the past?
The same thing that happened the last time I went back. I failed. Billions of people will still die.
Eric winced under the weight of it all.
And I'm one failed attempt away from being wiped from existence, so you'll excuse me if I don't have any sympathy for our departed friend.
Indiga wanted to respond, to help. He could help. After all, he wasn't just a pretty face. Sure, he wasn't as intelligent as Eric or gifted with mechanics like Artemis, but he wasn't an idiot. Except the sudden, jarring stop of the gondola interrupted their conversation. As they stepped out onto solid ground, the Strixari operator told them in a bored tone, "Stick to the path and you'll be fine." He gestured down to the glittering glass-like bricks that lined the dusty path. Their surface was polished enough to reflect the moon's light, giving them an illuminated guide. "But don't go wandering. The soil isn't exactly stable up here." The trio stepped out onto the glittering cobblestones and began to make for the opposite end. It wound lazily along the caldera, down and down until they reached a tiny hamlet nestled in the ash of the volcano. Several lamps had been lit, dangling from naked and leafless trees. The gentle glow of light invited them past pillars of onyx, each one carved with a different owl face. Figures of the past? As they navigated deeper into the town, Eric couldn't help but notice the fragility of each structure. Dozens of them choked beneath the weight of building ash, or were little more than bleached skeletons of their former glory. Time and nature slowly consumed everything around them. Indiga had tried to continue their earlier conversation, but Eric pointedly ignored him. He didn't have time for starry-eyed optimism. 2 yeses, 2 nos, a mantra rotting in his brain, each repetition louder than the last. Something moved out of his peripheral, causing Eric to jump, and he collided with Duck. This, of course, panicked the mutt, and he let out several wailing complaints that echoed around the caldera. After several seconds of calming the animal down, he turned back to what had scared him in the first place to see a Strixari holding out a hand. She was small, the top of her head only coming up to below his chest, and either her feathers were naturally gray, or she had become so stained by the ash that it was impossible to tell. She bowed low. "Greetings, pilgrims. Welcome to Otakada." The young Strixari extended her hand towards him, and Eric held out his in return. He wasn't sure what he was expecting. Currency, a gem, something to facilitate speaking with this god. But as a mound of ash was deposited into his palm, he frowned.
Thanks?
"The High Priestess awaits you inside. Take your offering to the creators."
He'd barely sucked in a breath to ask her what she meant when she dissolved back into the shadows, leaving her lamp on the ground. Eric licked his lips and looked over at Indiga.
"I have a handful of dirt and so many questions."
The Selkie shrugged. "I think we need to go in there." He pointed at the large building they had been stopped in front of. It had to be a temple. The structure resembled the ancient one his people had built for Kadiani. It was half glossy stone, half ashen sand. Windows were created from quartz, and lamps illuminated each floor with faint flickering light. The two remained frozen in the darkness, staring up at the imposing building as the moon rose high in the night sky. The doors opened with a thunderous creak, and a tall, venerable-looking Strixari stepped out, draped in linens of ivory and gold. She held out a lantern. No, Eric jolted at the sight of a small ball of fire dancing across the palm of her hand.
It is not often a high priestess must fetch her own disciples.
She clicked her beak at them, narrowing sharp yellow eyes at the pair.
I am Kina, first of the Order of Isen.
A low trilling hoot fell from her mouth when the Selkie and the elf failed to move.
Are you going to stay out here until the day I awakens, or...
Was he confused or annoyed? Eric balanced these two emotions, still consciously aware of his fistful of ashen dirt, until he realized he was both. With a flat look, he gestured the owl woman into motion.
Lead on, then.
Indiga, who had been gifted his own pile of sand before the young Strixari had left, nudged Duck into stepping in line behind his friend. They were led down a crooked hallway that twisted and turned, darting off into darkened rooms or barred-off doors until the interior opened up into a massive atrium. A simple staircase lined the wall, whirling up towards a gigantic, smoky quartz disk that allowed the moonlight into the temple. Nooks and haphazard floors broke up the cavernous space, and there were branches of stone and petrified wood jutting out on each landing, a roost for these monks. Starlight and moonlight filtered in from the faceted glass dome above them, dazzling them with shifting pinpricks of light. Eric was reminded of Kadaini's celestial chamber, a glittering sea of cosmos in an endless black void. He stared at the ground with each step, at every wall they passed, up at the stairs and to the perches in the atrium. This place had been crafted the very same way many of the buildings had in Himfaldir. No tool marks, no bricks or mortar adhesives, just naturally formed stone somehow molded into shape like sand castles.
How is this place standing? I assume there's no support structure beneath all this stonework.
Eric nearly bumped into their guide when the high priestess stopped before a large, glittering black dais in the middle of the atrium.
And with constant volcanic tremors.
Kina smiled at him as she nodded.
The mountain carves away at our temple a little more every day, but we are as ever expanding as the earth instructs. We take what is given, and we give what is taken.
She gestured to her right, to a recently collapsed portion of the atrium. Watching as several monks worked together, Eric stood in stunned silence. They were removing broken rubble, and instead of repairing what was there, they were creating something entirely new with the empty space. He turned back to the priestess.
That makes no sense. You just let this place crumble around you? There are ways to keep that from happening, to help the structure become more permanent.
Her wide, owlish eyes blinked several times.
Life teaches us that nothing is forever.
Kina held out her hand to the Selkie on the back of the giant dog and accepted his offering of ash. She moved so the others could see and, with her free hand, began to swirl magic through the dust. The dirt transformed into a figurine of a small mouse, earning the priestess a giddy clap from Indiga, but all Eric could do was stare at it with a frown.
Yeah, but things only move towards a state of entropy when there's no outside pressure forcing order back onto it. Rather than letting this place crumble to pieces, replace and shore up what's been broken away.
All things must end under the watchful gaze of the day and night eyes.
Kina closed her fingers around the tiny stone mouse and squeezed, returning it to its ashen state once more.
It is not our place to influence anything otherwise.
She gifted the pile of sand back to the Selkie and waved her hand towards 12 monks that occupied the dais.
Isen teaches us that creation is in constant balance with destruction.
Eric pondered the meaning of the high priestess's words as he stared at the figures around the dais. Each one was working on crafting something amazing from their own pile of ashen sand. There were beautiful and intricate mandalas, elaborate miniature cities created from dust, and one monk was molding his dirt into geodes, cracking them open to reveal the beautiful crystal formations inside. He stepped around Kina, moving to each of the 12 figures circling the floor, building and creating in the dancing moonlight. He stopped before a burly Strixari who had recreated Lyra's exact likeness in ash, down to the thick Shetland fur of her horse half and the curls in her mane of hair. He was about to ask if the monk had ever met the goddess, when the owl man raised his hands towards the court's dome and then brought them down in a swift motion, dissolving the figure back to ash. Eric's mouth fell ajar as he turned to see the geode maker crush his beautiful creations into glittering dust. The mandala artist had swept up their intricate designs that had surely taken them days to make, and the city builder reminded Eric of Godzilla as he smashed the buildings beneath his hands. He spun, staring up at Kina with a twisted expression of confusion.
Why spend your time on something so temporary? It makes no sense.
It is how we meditate.
The high priestess smiled once more and moved towards an empty golden bowl on the floor.
It is how we relieve ourselves of negativity and show our devotion to Isin.
She waved her hand down to the dish at her feet.
Just as you will.
What?
She reached out, taking the elf's hand in hers, and pried back those blackened fingers.
You will take this.
Kina guided his hand over to the bowl and tipped the pile of ash into it.
And you will create. Inspiration calms the mind, allows you to look within and reach a state of tranquility. Only then will Isin find you.
At an utter loss for words, Eric stared at the dusting of ash on his hands and then to the pile in the dish at his feet. He did this several times before his brain rebooted and he sputtered back to life.
I'm here to see a god, not build sandcastles.
He took a steadying breath.
How is this supposed to help me?
Hooting with laughter, Kina stepped back, folding her arms behind her.
It is the pursuit of enlightenment we seek here, not the end of the journey. Meditate, calm the mind, and Isin might bless you with their presence.
She narrowed her eyes with a deep smile.
But no one here has reached that level yet, not even me.
A mixed noise of bewilderment croaked out from Eric's open mouth when the high priestess refused to elaborate any further and turned her back on him. She moved around the room, observing the creation and destruction progress of several monks, leaving him to cobble together any functioning, rational thought he could. But all he managed was a simple word.
Huh?
Ink-stained rapids gave way to slowly churning waters before Lucian was able to haul himself and his brother onto the muddy banks of the river. He coughed and hacked, vomiting the water from his stomach and lungs. His elbows and knees gave an exhausted tremble as he rolled to his side, staring up at the sunset sky. Golden hues painted the wisps of clouds that obscured the 3 moons from view, and he sighed. They had made it back to the Wild Queen's realm. He turned his head, looking over at the sibling he had pulled from the waters. His brother wasn't breathing, and that jagged arrow shaft was still protruding from his chest. Pink water pooled beneath him, and a dark stain was rapidly spreading across his tunic.
Varen!
Lucian hadn't been lying when he told his brother he didn't regret his actions. Not Varen's exile, engineering the death of their father, the ongoing stall tactics with the Brotherhood. None of it. He hated everything his little sibling stood for. But as he stared at the man, motionless and silent, he knew that he didn't hate Varen. Somewhere along the way, a bond had been formed between the two. It was a tenuous thing, fragile and delicate like spun gold. But Varen had stood up to Elias for Lucian's sake, saving his life despite knowing what he had done. He continuously attempted to extend the proverbial olive branch, regardless of how often Lucian made it clear that they were not equals. He didn't want to care. He wanted to watch the world burn. And honestly, a part of him wanted Varen to just die. But something inside him rebelled at that thought. The idea that the one person who still held some sliver of affection for him might cease to be? That gagging emotion stuck in his throat, and Lucian released a feral scream as he reached over and slammed his fist hard against his sibling's chest. Varen shot upright, hauling in a ragged, wet gasp as the dull haze of dreamless sleep evaporated. Pain lanced through his very being, radiating out from the arrow still protruding from his chest. He coughed up water and slumped onto his back once more, rolling in agony.
"You idiot!"
Lucian snarled those two words, hiding the relief that washed over him.
"Why would you take that arrow for me?"
Why had he done that? Varen asked himself. The response his mind came up with wasn't because they were family, but because that's what a good person would do. A hero.
"An idiot,"
he thought as he winced at the redoubling of the pain. Lucian scoffed, but he was already on his hands and knees beside his brother, inspecting the broken shaft that still protruded from his chest.
"How are you alive?"
Varen blinked groggily down at the mortal wound, just as confused himself, then went wide-eyed when Lucian grasped the arrow and yanked. He grimaced at the tight pinch of pain he felt as the tip of the arrow slid past pierced skin, but in truth, it hadn't hurt nearly as bad as it should have. He gingerly inspected the wound. It had barely penetrated him, the bulk of the attack reduced by the thick padding of his tunic. But as he began pulling back the torn cloth to get a better look, a small black stone tumbled from the inner breast pocket. It fell, cold, against the inside lining of his sleeve, and he extended his arm, shaking the jewel from his clothes. Varen reached for the prison gem that contained little Amari's transfigured soul. Large cracks swept over the surface, and a sizable chunk had been carved out of one of the sides. The stone had deflected the arrow, reducing its momentum and likely preventing it from killing him.
"You lucky bastard."
Lucian tossed the spent shaft aside and nodded at the stone.
"You saved her life. She saved yours. I suppose that makes you even."
With a grunt of effort, he pushed himself to his feet, wobbling a little as his body adjusted to the ache of fatigue. Reaching down, Varen's fingers touched the stone, and he immediately felt a ravenous pull on his shade. He silently cried out, yanking his hand away.
"What is it?"
Lucian squinted down at the fragile gem.
"Ah."
He met his brother's terror with understanding.
"Well, I guess that explains the change in your hair."
Confused, Varen glanced up and caught sight of the ends of his bangs. They had turned white, just like what Eric had done to Ruby. His breathing hitched when he pulled his damp braid over his shoulder to see the same long streaks of white were interwoven through his black hair.
"She fed on your shade while you drowned."
Lucian barked a mirthless laugh. Varen reached for the stone once more, his fingertip brushing the glossy surface. The moment his skin made contact, he felt that tug on his shade. He resisted this time, mentally speaking clearly to the entity trapped inside. "Amari, can you hear me?" There was no response in his mind, but he could feel a reaction, a stirring within the stone, and a sensation like endless hunger brushing against his awareness. Maybe if he could reach her...
"Stop being a self-sacrificing fool."
Lucian smacked away the rock and gave his brother a disapproving glower.
"Your shade can't take any more. You'll die if you let her run amok."
Lucian sucked in a breath through his scrunched nose, refusing to hide his disgust.
"Just toss it into the river and be done with it."
He straightened his back and spun on the spot, squinting through the haze of golden light.
Now where is that damned lichen?
Already racked with weakness, Herron nodded numbly. His brother was right. The poor girl was now nothing more than a twisted monster, a malevolent echo of what she had once been. Even if he did feel like it was partly his fault, there was no hope for her.
Winter!
As Herron watched his brother stumble down the beach, he thought of the wolf and of the revenant riding with him. He glanced back at the stone. If Wraith could be saved, maybe. Tentatively, he touched a finger to its surface. His head drooped a little as the Shade-Eater once again attacked his soul with sharp teeth. He resisted the urge to pull away, allowing her to nibble at his shade.
Amari, please, we can work together.
Something dark and angry flared on the edge of his mind. He was too weak, too tired. Now was not the time for this. But his morals wouldn't let him leave her. He was a good person, a hero, an idiot. Herron tore free a scrap of fabric from the ends of his tunic and scooped up the gem. He wrapped it up tightly until he could feel only a faint scrabble from the entity within. He frowned at it for a moment, once again debating the wisdom of this, before he tucked it into a pocket. This was a quest for a different day. He attempted to stand, but froze at the sight of glinting steel flashing in the light of the 3 moons. Herron scrambled away on his backside until he bumped into the armored boots of a soldier. Fear prickled his being as he looked up. Instead of the indigo-colored skin and white hair of the Dark Fae, he was met with the rich amber hues of the Wild Queen's Guard.
By the order of Exilia Folkgrave, trespassers are to stand trial and face Her Majesty's judgment.
A blade lowered to rest against his neck, and Herron could do nothing but shakily raise his hands in surrender. For a moment, he held out hope that the others might escape, then sighed in defeat when he caught sight of his brother, attempting to explain who they were. But this far out of bounds, there was no way they'd talk their way out of it. The only silver lining? He could also see their missing werewolf was still alive, even if he was bound in irons already. Talk about the fire and the iron skillet. Shifting anxiously in his bed, Eric stared up at the patchwork ceiling, repaired and replaced several times over. The mattress was an open-top box filled with thousands of small onyx spheres and fine grains of ash sand. Despite how surprisingly comfortable it was, he rarely scrounged up more than a few hours of sleep, and only when exhaustion overtook him. He had spent the last 5 weeks listening to the monks as they attempted to teach him that everything in this world was finite, that change was inevitable, as if he didn't know. He grumbled, still picturing the intricate mandalas they made him create from sand that the monks would then sweep up into piles to release out the window at the end of each day. Their way of helping him purify his soul and release that positivity into the world. Small-minded superstitions and fortune cookie philosophy. Eric hated every minute of it. He moved to the smoky quartz glass of his room's window and pushed against it. A gust of cold air rushed in, sending goosebumps across his skin. He wrapped his thin blanket over his shoulders, for all the good it would do him, and leaned against the sill. Eric watched the frosty pink light of dawn spill over the lip of the caldera and wash everything below in cold morning light. 5 weeks, no answers, and still the guillotine of 2 yeses and 2 nos hung precarious over his neck. He had lost track of the time he'd spent traversing this little continent, the train rides and the near-death experiences. But if he had to guess, they had settled into what would presumably be early December. He had missed his birthday. But if he could fix everything, there might still be time to celebrate Vels. He let out a foggy sigh into the chilly air and turned back to his room. Most of the Strixari would soon retire for sleep, being nocturnal. Only his tutors and the groundkeepers remained awake during daylight hours. He knew he should be attempting to do the same, but his brain was too wired for rest. He pulled his bag out from beneath his bed and began sorting through the contents. He dumped out a pile of letters from Artemis, who had been kind enough to send him updates on all he had been learning. In truth, the necromancer's correspondence had taught him more of shade theory than even wraith. The unbidden thought of his friend stabbed at him, and he quickly shoved the letters back into the pack, tossing it to the floor. It tipped where it landed, and a sheaf of blank paper slid free, something he had picked up recently after realizing he had left his journal back with Artemis. Perhaps if he laid everything out, he might gain some perspective. For the first time since his disastrous trip into Kunskap, Eric reached for a pen. He slumped into his bed, sinking into the marbles, and pushed the nib to the paper. His hands shook, but the weighted gloves kept them steady enough for him to convey his thoughts in a semi-legible script. It only took Eric 15 minutes to spiral back into mania, filling page after page with details on his own timeline, the machine he had built in Bulwark's barn, a doodle of Obus's deer skull face, and branching trajectories of potential timelines should he manage to change the past as he hoped. He grabbed a fresh page with a shuddering sigh. That's some awfully furious scribbling going on over there. Eric startled, the bundle of papers slipping from his trembling hands as he looked over to the other bed in the room. Indigo was propped up on one elbow, watching him with a curious lift of his brow. He shot the man a weary smile before he tucked all the things back into his bag and nudged it under his bed.
I'm just trying to make space in my brain. Meditate and all.
He hated that word. Hated the notion that it was the only way he'd gain access to this god.
Some people prefer mandalas to clear their head. I like writing things down.
Indigo pushed himself up, sitting with his back to the wall and his legs dangling over the edge of his bed. He narrowed his eyes at the man, unsure if he was to believe the words that fell from his mouth.
Make any progress? In reaching Issen?
Eric gave a sarcastic look around the room, as if searching for the god.
Nope, doesn't look like it.
You know what I mean. Indigo grabbed his hairband, using it to tame his frizzy locks. What are you really doing? Sighing, Eric cast about for something else to look at.
I can't really expect you to understand.
He shot a grimace at the Selkie.
No offense, but Kadaiani's gonna feed me to a black hole as soon as this god decides to show themselves. So forgive me if I can't clear my mind and meditate.
Who says this god will cast you with a no? Rumus and Lyra felt you could be trusted. You just gotta believe in yourself and stop thinking negatively. Indigo reached over, scratching Duck behind his ears. Show them that you learned from your past mistakes.
My past mistakes are what I'm trying to fix.
Learning from and fixing are two different things. Indigo moved to the edge of his bed, planting his one foot on the cold stone floor. There's no use crying over rotten fish. You're supposed to accept the way...
I can't accept what I've done!
Eric didn't mean to shout, but the words, filled with fury, erupted from his lungs. His breathing trembled as it left him, and he looked away.
I can't continue like this, knowing that I've ruined so many lives.
His brother, Lucas, his mom, Pyra and Varen, Elias.
You can't ask me to do nothing.
Look at my legs. Eric blinked, caught off guard by the odd request. He complied, glancing over to the withered and mangled limbs.
Okay.
Would you agree that what happened to me was horrible? That it ruined my life as I knew it? Indigo gave him a hard look. And yet, if this had never happened, I never would have needed Duck in my life. I never would have pushed myself to become a Pathfinder. I never would have been there to save you. His expression softened, and he smiled.
Change is scary, but it gives us space for something new to take hold. You can learn from your mistakes, but never let them consume you.
What is the point of learning something if you can't use it?
Eric's agitation spiked.
Sure, it worked out fine for you, but that's one person's experience. What if you had died instead?
Casting a frown at the ceiling, Indiga sighed. We're friends, right? Eric, who hadn't truly considered anyone a friend other than Wraith since his time in college, shrugged uncomfortably.
Yeah, I think so.
Indiga, not missing the hesitation, made a grunting noise as he convinced Duck off the bed. He shoved his few scattered belongings into his own bag and tossed it over the dog's large haunches. I've been trying to help you since I rescued you, to guide you in the right direction and push you to see what you're always so blind to. But I think... He paused for a moment, considering, before climbing onto Duck's back. That me being here is a crutch for you. It took a moment for that to sink in, and when it did, Eric felt the fires of hurt and indignation blaze in his gut.
That's absurd! You're the one who wanted to join me! I didn't ask you to come!
He jumped to his feet, vitriol bubbling in his veins. Friends don't wait to be asked. They just offer help when they see it's needed. Indiga set his jaw, trying to convince himself that this was the right course of action. But if you want answers, you need to find them in yourself. My trying to hand them to you isn't working.
Hand them to me? I don't need a conscience. I don't need you to perch on my shoulder like some damn cricket.
Eric began furiously pacing a circle in the dusty stone floor.
I'm trying to do more than just survive. I'm playing a stupid game with gods and attempting to keep this reality from spiraling into more chaos. I'm trying to undo what I've done.
You're a good man, Eric, with a good heart. You just need to listen to it more often. Indiga gave the elf a sad smile, then nudged Duck forward and extended down a hand. If you survive this, come find me in Okari. We are still friends after all. Yanked from his own spiraling rage, Eric could think of no other way to respond than to hesitantly take the hand offered to him. His mouth clamped tight, and a frown pressed hard into his brow. Indiga shook Eric's hand with vigor, that sad smile fading. Grammy will have some fish and cabbage stew waiting for you when you get there. And with that, the dog and the Selkie left their shared room. Eric stood there, in shock, listening to the clack, clack, clack of nails on stone until he couldn't hear them anymore. Don't leave me, he said in a whisper. But he did, because everyone always left him. He didn't want to face this alone. He reached up, rubbing his knuckles into his eyes before they could tear up. What just happened?
Well, you pushed away another person, that's what.
Eric shushed that internal voice, scowling at it as if it had any right to speak to him.
Fine.
He whirled around, jaw set and heart hardened.
This is fine. In fact, one less person to worry about,
Eric thought as he knelt, reaching for his bag once more and pulled out the small parcel hidden within. It had arrived for him several days ago, but he had been apprehensive about its contents. Forgetting his journal back with Artemis had bore unexpected fruits. He slid free a brick-sized box and dropped it onto his mattress of marbles and sand. He cleared the dust away with a wave of his hand and stared down at the necromancer's loopy, elegant handwriting scrawled across the note taped to the top. They say all wounds heal with time, but when you're short on the latter, perhaps a bandage will help with the former. Artemis. You've been listening to Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron, Book 5 in the series here on Tall Tale TV. If you would like to listen to the entire book in one place, or any of her other novels, you can find them at talltaletv.com/series, or by following the links in the description.
Oh no! Not again. Oh, sweet baby carrots. Oh, man. We survived. Oh, thanks, little guy. I don't think I could have made that without you.
Where are we? I fell asleep and was taking a nap.
Are you freaking kidding me?
Oh, hey, who's that?
By the order of Exilia Falkgrave, all trespassers must face the Queen's...
Oh, come on.